price of Bitcoin is going to go up to $10 million coin. The difference between 2% inflation or 2% deflection per year and 0% deflection or 0% inflation is the difference between an average life expectancy of 70 and immortality. What's the difference between perfect money and imperfect money? Perfect money is economic immortality. Imperfect money is we all have a short, brutal life. The Chinese will embrace Bitcoin. Name a company that's still in existence from 100 years ago off the top of your head where the stock is worth more today in real terms than it was then. What if I told you I could make your company live forever? When you have a need to know, when you have a crisis, if your country is in crisis, if your company is in crisis, if your family is in crisis, when the bank freezes and fails and the currency crashes and you have a business or you have a life and you're in that culture, you have a need to know, your eyes are open, now you adopt Bitcoin. Trump has discovered Bitcoin. Trump has a need to know. Before cryptography and the internet and modern semiconductors, you couldn't create a Bitcoin. If you can't create a Bitcoin, you can't create perfect money. If you don't have perfect money, then you can't actually posit an economy where the money doesn't deflect, where the money is true. When the money becomes true, the money is the asset which is used to channel capital through time and space, right? The essence of economics is the proper allocation of capital. And so Satoshi gave us a perfect money. The perfect money made it possible to capture, to store, to channel, to distribute capital, to program capital in an economy. And how profound is that? Well, I mean, the difference between 2% inflation or 2% deflection per year and 0% deflection or 0% inflation is the difference between an average life expectancy of 70 and immortality. Right? We figured out how not to die, right? It's pretty profound, right? When you think about it like that, what's the difference between perfect money and imperfect money? Perfect money is economic immortality. Imperfect money is we all have a short, brutal life, right? Terminated early. There's a time when there's a 40% infant mortality rate between the ages of 0 and 5, right? Your kids are going to die. There's a time when the likelihood that a woman giving birth dies in childbirth was like 30%, right? You know, before science crashed into medicine, you know, your children were more likely than not to die. You know, your wife was more likely than not to die in childbirth. If you got her pregnant 3 times, it was a death sentence. And so you think about life before science impinged on medicine, pretty big deal. You think about science impinging upon astronomy, a pretty big deal. Science, you know, blasting into navigation, right? Pretty big deal. And now science colliding with economics, pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's for me also fascinating. I asked the question so many times on my podcast, like, how does Bitcoin change things? Like, how does Bitcoin change society on a big level? And you all say also in the presentation, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. And you also say like paradigm shift that Bitcoin is. And now also like it changes the way we interact with so many things. How different will be a world when we look out like 50, 100, maybe even like 1,000 years, where we have this sound money on a digital realm, all of the sudden this perfect money. How different is world, and what is possible on that scale?
I think if you look at economic creatures, the classic economic creature in modern society is the corporation. The average life expectancy of a corporation is something like 10 years. You create a company and it lasts more than 10 years, then you've lived longer than most. The number of corporations that are more than 100 years old. Right? What percentage of people live to be more than 100? like 0.1% or 0.01%. What percentage of corporations love to be more than 100? 0.0001%. Well, what if I told you I could make your company live forever? Right? It's so how profound. We're talking about eliminating corporate mortality, right? We're talking about stretching economic vitality easily by a factor of 10, maybe by a factor of 100, maybe by a factor of a million. So, how will it change society? Well, it won't change society uniformly the same everywhere. It's like, Gibson says, the future's already with us, but it's not evenly distributed, right? In the modern world today, there are people in New York City that live in skyscrapers up 80 floors, and there are people that live in Africa in mud huts, And you can find certain peoples that are still stuck in Neolithic Stone Age cultures if you look hard enough. And you can find people that if the electricity was turned off to their elevator, they'd die. Right? And so very, very, very profound difference. I think you got to look at Bitcoin is this pure digital capital, which means it's the technology to capitalize a family, capitalize an individual, capitalize a corporation, capitalize an institution, a charity, a nonprofit, or a country or a city. So, or a university, right? We throw away throw around the word capitalize as a colloquialism, like, oh, you're going to capitalize on that? Okay, but if you think, and that's because economics has been pseudoscience and capital has been kind of a liberal arts type word. If you walked up to people on the street and said, what do you think capital is? And you asked them before Satoshi or before they understood Bitcoin, it's not clear what they would give you as an answer. They would, say something about Karl Marx said it was bad or capitalists to do something with it, but it's such a fuzzy word. But in the aftermath of Bitcoin, capital is economic energy, and I give you an asset to store economic energy. And now, if I can store economic energy in a digital asset, I can move the capital potentially at the speed of light at high frequency. So I can move it through space, right? Can you actually oscillate capital at 10 megahertz? You can oscillate, you can create a 10 megahertz signal, right? 10 kilohertz signal you could probably hear, right? So at certain frequencies, when you're vibrating energy, right, you get a result. Capital's never been something we could work with, we could program. So Bitcoin allows you to program and channel capital through time and space. And in time, it means that we have the hope of addressing things like global payments for 8 billion people at the speed of light off of mobile phones with no intermediary, right? So that's interesting. How do I actually do 100 transactions a second if I'm an AI bot and I want to trip through cyberspace, right? I mean, that's interesting. You won't do that without digital energy or digital capital. But the other issue is, well, how do you actually send a bunch of capital forward in time 100 years, right? And you can't do it with gold. You can't do it with a building. You can't do it with a share of stock. I mean, name a company that's still in existence from 100 years ago off the top of your head where the stock is worth more today in real terms than it was then. It would be kind of challenging, right? So projecting economic energy through time and space has really been more of an aspirational fantasy, right? Or an art than it was ever a science or engineering discipline. Bitcoin, it takes something from the artistic and from the religious and from the political domain, and it moves it into the engineering domain, where now there is actually a precise way to move capital around, to store capital, to capitalize. And I guess your question is, how will the world change? Profoundly, right? I mean, I can create an AI that can live in cyberspace capitalized by Bitcoin that will live forever, that'll have economic mortality, that is completely sovereign from a company, a person, a country. That AI could, in theory, split itself, go viral and spawn 10 million more AIs that are all sovereign. It's a life form, right? It's right. I can endow a university, a nonprofit, a foundation with Bitcoin that could conceivably last 1,000 years without anybody working for it, right? I can create new types of entities. I can create companies that don't have a life expectancy of 10 years, and I can create a company with a likely life expectancy of 100 or 500 or 1,000 years. I can have different missions. I can think differently about how I capitalize or finance my country. I think differently about how I build. Every product and service could be different, right? If you think about products that are around us all the time, life insurance products or any kind of annuity products, all of those things, right, will be disrupted. Maybe they'll be dematerialized. Right? There's an entire industry that shuffles around $400 trillion of assets. So we have $400 trillion of 20th century analog assets that are inefficient, that are toxic, that are dilutive, and those are handled by a massive financial establishment that's inefficient, right? And so you have a very inefficient establishment handling inefficient assets, trading them back and forth inefficiently. You could obliterate it all. You could just replace it all with I have Bitcoin, I hold it. I don't need the establishment. I don't need the bank to hold it. I don't need the Wall Street firm to trade it. I don't need to trade it. I don't need to diversify across. Why do I buy the S&P 500 index? Why do I have to buy 500 different companies when I know that most of them are not even that good or that successful, but I have an entire financial infrastructure to trade and rebalance inferior assets as a store of value? What if you just obliterate it all, right? Maybe it all just goes away. So I think the world changes, but it'll change in every sector, in every part of the world at a different rate, depending upon politics, depending upon leadership,